The biting solitude of the Wyoming high country was the only medicine John Foster ever found for the wounds he couldn't name. It was 1878, and the war was a lifetime ago, more than a decade gone, but its ghost was a constant companion, walking beside him in the thin, frigid air. Christmas Eve was descending with a furious blizzard, a maelstrom of wind and blinding snow that had already raged for 2 days, burying the high country under a deep, unforgiving white blanket. The world outside his small cabin had been reduced to a roaring white chaos, an external reflection of the storm that often raged within him. His cabin, a squat, sturdy structure of hewn logs chinked with mud and defiance, stood a stone's throw from a frozen creek. Its back was pressed against a stand of unyielding pines, their branches heavy with a thick mantle of snow. He had built it with his own 2 hands, a fortress against memory, a bastion against the world of men that had chewed him up and spat him out. John was a tall man, made lean and hard by relentless work and a sparse diet. His face, weathered by a relentless sun and an even more relentless wind, was a topographical map of past hardships, with deep lines etched around eyes the color of a stormy sky. His hands were calloused and capable, as comfortable wrapped around the handle of an axe as they had once been around the stock of a rifle. He worked as a ranch hand for a cattleman named Patterson, whose main spread was a hard half-day's ride away. The arrangement suited them both, for John received his pay in supplies and the unspoken right to be utterly and completely left alone. Town was a place he actively avoided. Lander was a raw, burgeoning settlement, a chaotic symphony of noise, commerce, and the suffocating judgment of others. He saw it in their faces, the same blind, unthinking certainty that had sent Boys, his own younger brother among them, marching proudly into the meat grinder of the Civil War. The phantom thunder of cannon fire still echoed in his quietest moments, a ghostly tinnitus of the soul. So he kept to his cabin, to the silent company of the snow-covered landscape and the unsparing, indifferent mountains. This particular winter had been a bitter one, relentless in its brutal assault. The current blizzard was the worst he'd seen in his years here. It was in the deceptive, momentary quiet of the storm's lull that he heard it, a sound that did not belong to the harsh symphony of the wilderness. It was human. A thin, desperate cry, swallowed almost immediately by the wind's returning howl. John froze, every muscle tensed, his head cocked towards the sound. He tried to dismiss it, thinking he had finally imagined it, just another phantom from a past filled with the cries of the dying. But then it came again, fainter this time, but unmistakable. A cry for help. His body moved before his mind had fully consented, an instinct to act overriding years of practiced isolation. He pulled on his heavy sheepskin coat, wrapped a wool scarf around the lower half of his face, grabbed his rifle, and plunged into the waist-deep snow. The cold was a physical blow, a shock to the system that stole his breath. The wind was a living, malevolent thing that tore at his lungs and stung his eyes. He fought his way forward, his gaze scanning the churning white expanse, searching for the source of the cry that had pierced his solitude. And then he saw it. A flash of dark fabric against the stark white, a single figure huddled against a massive snowdrift, their strength clearly failing. They were a fragile anchor in a world of violent, chaotic motion. He did not hesitate. He pushed through the biting wind and the deep, heavy snow, the effort a burning strain on his lungs and a fire in his legs. As he drew closer, he could make out the form of a woman, her clothes wholly inadequate for the brutal conditions. She was collapsed, her face pale with the encroaching cold. He reached her, gasping for air, his own breath pluming in the frigid air. "Hold on," he yelled over the wind, his voice a rough bark. She was shivering violently, almost convulsing, her teeth chattering a frantic, desperate rhythm. He worked quickly, his numb hands digging away the snow that had begun to drift over her. He managed to get his arms under her, surprised by her weight. She was not a small woman, she was solidly built, with a fullness to her figure that spoke of a life before this desperate struggle. She was a dead weight in his arms, her body limp with exhaustion and cold. Using the last reserves of his strength, he began the brutal fight back to the cabin. He half-dragged, half-carried her through the blizzard's unabated fury, collapsing inside the small cabin, his chest heaving as he slammed the door against the storm. He rolled onto his side, pressing his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. He found one, faint and thready, but it was there. She let out a racking cough, and her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of warm honey, wide with a primal, animal fear. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from exertion and disuse. "You're safe." She stared at him, trembling violently, her simple wool dress in tatters and frozen stiff. Where am I?" she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. "My land," he said, rising stiffly to his feet. "My cabin." "You need to get warm," and fast he reached a hand down to help her, but she flinched away from his touch, scrambling backward like a startled doe. "No," she said, her voice shaking but laced with a surprising firmness. "Don't take me to town. Please, whatever you do, don't take me to land." Her plea was so filled with a palpable dread it stopped him cold. "I'm not taking you anywhere," he said gruffly, his tone softening slightly at her terror. "But you'll die of cold if you don't get out of those wet things. The cabin is your only choice." She watched him for a long, agonizing moment, her honey-colored eyes searching his weathered face, weighing one unknown danger against another. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, she relented. She tried to stand, but her legs, numb and weak, gave way beneath her. Without a word, John scooped her into his arms. She was heavier than he'd expected, a substantial weight that felt strangely grounding in the chaotic swirl of the storm and his own emotions. She went stiff at his touch, a rigid fear radiating from her, but she did not fight him. He carried her the few steps to the hearth and gently set her down in the single sturdy chair that sat beside it. The small one-room space was spare and orderly, a reflection of its occupant. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a narrow cot was pushed against the other, and a rough-sawn table with a second chair completed the furnishings. It was the scent of the place, of wood smoke, coffee, and a deep, ingrained solitude that seemed to unnerve her the most. She was an intrusion, a disruption to this quiet, ordered world, and they both knew it. "Get those wet things off," he ordered, his back already turned as he added more wood to the fire, coaxing the flames to a roaring life. It was a command born of pure practicality, not prurience. He did not look at her, giving her what little privacy the small, intimate room allowed. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the sound of her chattering teeth. He felt a flash of irritation, a resentment at this sudden, violent intrusion into the quiet rhythm of his life. He had not asked for this, for a half-frozen woman with terror in her eyes to land on his doorstep. Yet, as he listened to the soft rustle of wet, frozen fabric being peeled from skin, a different feeling stirred within him, something akin to a reluctant curiosity. Who was she, and what in God's name was she running from that was worse than a Wyoming blizzard on Christmas Eve? He finally allowed himself to glance over his shoulder. She was huddled in his spare blanket, her wet clothes draped over the other chair, steaming in the heat of the fire. Her light brown hair was a tangled, wet mess, and dark bruises were already beginning to purple on her pale skin. Her frame was large, her shoulders broad, her hips full. She was a woman built not for fragility, but for strength, though at this moment, she looked like she would shatter at a harsh word. "My name is John Foster," he said, his voice gruff as he broke the heavy silence. She looked up, her wide, honey-colored eyes meeting his for the first time without immediate, flinching fear. "I am Beatrice," she whispered, her voice soft and trembling. They sat that way for a long time, sipping the hot, bitter coffee he brewed for her. He watched her over the rim of his own cup, noting the way she flinched when a log popped and spit in the fire. She was wound tight with secrets and fear. As dusk settled, casting long shadows across the small cabin, an awkward tension fell between them. There was only one cot. "You take the bed," he said, his tone flat and leaving no room for argument. "I'll sleep by the fire." She nodded, her eyes downcast, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. He laid out his bedroll on the rough plank floor, keeping his back to her as he did. He was acutely, uncomfortably aware of her every movement, the soft rustle as she moved to the cot. He stared into the dying embers of the fire, willing sleep to come, but his mind was agitated, stirred up by her unexpected presence. The cabin felt smaller, the air charged with a strange, unwelcome intimacy. He heard her move behind him, the soft pad of her bare feet on the wooden floor. Her voice came out of the darkness, a trembling whisper. Mr. Foster? He did not move, did not turn. What is it? There was a long, pregnant pause. He could hear the unsteady rhythm of her breathing, the catch in her throat. Sir, her voice came again, this time barely audible over the howl of the wind outside. Do you want to look at me? The question hit him like a stray bullet, stunning him. He remained frozen, his back to her, every muscle in his body tensing. Then, her voice, even quieter, laced with a deep, hollow resignation, asked the question that laid her soul bare. Will you stay if I undress? In those words, he heard the echo of 100 sordid transactions he could only imagine. He heard the shame, the resignation, the awful, hollow bartering of a woman who believed she had nothing left to sell but her own body. They were an offer of payment for her rescue, for the food, for the shelter, for his protection. A hot, unfamiliar shame washed over him, mingled with a surge of white-hot anger, at her, at the men who had driven her to this, at a world that could break a person down to such a desperate point. He turned his head just enough to see her silhouette in the dim firelight. She stood by the cot, clutching the blanket to her full form, a single, fragile shape in the vast, lonely darkness. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his body fully away from her, presenting her with nothing but his rigid, unyielding back. He stared hard into the glowing coals, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. Get some sleep, he said, his voice a low, rough rasp, thick with emotions he couldn't name. No one is going to bother you here. He did not hear her move for a long, long time. When she finally did, it was the quiet sound of the cot ropes creaking under her weight, followed by a soft, choked sob that she tried and failed to stifle in the darkness. John Foster lay on the hard floor, listening to the sound of her weeping and the unabated roar of the blizzard, feeling the first, painful crack spread across the frozen walls he had so carefully built around his heart. The heavy snow made travel impossible for days, trapping them in a world no bigger than John's small plot of land. Beatrice, it turned out, was not a woman who could abide idleness. A strange, unspoken rhythm developed between them. She cooked and cleaned with a quiet, tireless efficiency, her hands always busy, as if stillness was her enemy. She rarely spoke, but her actions filled the small cabin with a sense of warmth it had never known. Little by little, in fragmented sentences and hesitant whispers, her story emerged. She had been married to a man in Lander, a merchant named Franklin Thorne. He was a respected man in town, but behind closed doors, he was a monster. He had a cruel tongue and a heavy hand, and both were often directed at Beatrice. He derided her for her size, calling her lazy and gluttonous, even as he worked her to the bone in his shop and home. He had purchased her from her destitute father, a transaction that had made her feel more like property than a wife. She had endured the beatings, the verbal abuse, the humiliation, for 2 long years. The final straw had come on Christmas Eve when he'd beaten her for accidentally breaking a plate, promising her that when he returned from the saloon, he would teach her a lesson she would never forget. She knew in her bones that this time, she might not survive it. So she had fled in the dead of night, with only the clothes on her back, running blindly into the raging blizzard, choosing the certain danger of the storm over the certain brutality of her husband. John listened, his face a granite mask that betrayed none of the fury churning within him. He knew the kind of men like Thorne, men who hid their cruelty behind a veneer of respectability. He understood the casual evil, the utter lack of law or mercy for a woman in her position. As she spoke of her fear and her shame, he found himself speaking of his own. He told her of the war, of his brother Samuel, who had died of dysentery in a fetid camp in Virginia without ever seeing a real battle. He told her how he'd come back to find his family farm gone, his parents dead from grief and hardship, his future erased. He told her how he'd come west to lose himself, to outrun the ghosts that whispered his brother's name on the wind. Their confessions hung in the air between them, a fragile bridge built of shared ruin and quiet understanding. For the first time, Beatrice looked at him not as a savior or a potential threat, but as a man who understood the universal language of grief. Their companionship was a thing of quiet spaces and unspoken gestures. A language grew between them in the way he left a bucket of fresh water for her by the door each morning, and the way she left a hot cup of coffee for him on the hearth before he ventured out to check his traps. For the first time since the war, John felt the sharp, jagged edges of his solitude begin to soften. Her presence was a low, steady warmth against the persistent, biting chill of his memories. But with this growing comfort came a new, unsettling tension. One afternoon, he returned to the cabin from clearing a path to the creek and saw her down by the water's edge, which had begun to thaw in a patch. She was washing her long, light brown hair, her back to him. The weak winter sunlight filtered through the cottonwoods, dappling her skin and illuminating the strong, graceful curve of her back and her full, rounded hips. It was a simple, innocent act, but watching her, John felt a powerful, visceral jolt of desire. It was so sharp and unexpected that he turned away abruptly, his heart hammering in his chest, ashamed of the thoughts that had risen so easily and unbidden. She was a survivor, a refugee he had sworn to protect. She was not for him to want. The outside world, loud and unwelcome, intruded on the fourth day. John saw a rider coming from a long way off, a dark speck against the endless white. A flicker of raw panic crossed Beatrice's face. "Who is that?" she asked, her voice trembling as she shrank back from the window. "Just a hand from the ranch, likely," John said, trying to reassure her. "He won't bother you," but as the rider drew closer, his gut tightened. It wasn't one of Patterson's men. It was a stout, hard-faced man he didn't recognize, followed by two others who looked more like hired thugs than ranch hands. "Thorne," Beatrice whispered, the name a cold stone in his stomach. All the color drained from her face. "It's him." She scrambled away from the door, seeking refuge in the darkest corner of the cabin like a mouse darting from a hawk. Thorne and his men reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin, their expressions a toxic mixture of arrogance and menace. "Well, well," Thorne called out, his eyes sweeping over the small, isolated homestead with a proprietary air. "Looks like my property has wandered off." He dismounted, his movement slow and deliberate, designed to intimidate. "I've come for what's mine, Foster. The woman and the trouble she's caused me." "She owes you nothing," John said, his voice dangerously calm. He stood on the porch, a solid, immovable wall between the men and the cabin. His gun was not drawn, but his hand hovered near its hilt, a silent promise of violence. "Stay out of this, Yankee," one of Thorne's men growled, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow. "This is our business." "She is my business now," John stated, his voice flat and final. Thorne's face purpled with rage. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he spat, and lunged for the cabin door. John moved with the startling speed of a striking snake. He shoved Thorne back with one powerful hand and drew his pistol with the other. But he had underestimated them, or overestimated his own ability to handle three men at once. The second hired man was already moving, not with a gun, but with a long, wicked-looking knife. As John turned to face the new threat, the man rushed him, the blade a silver arc in the pale winter light. He parried the first thrust, the steel scraping harshly against his gun barrel. He brought the heavy pistol down in a brutal arc, catching the man on the side of the head. The man staggered, but he was tough and enraged. He came back, jabbing low and fast. John felt a sudden, white-hot fire in his left side. He grunted in pain and surprise as the blade sank deep into his ribs. He stumbled back against the cabin wall, a dark, wet stain already spreading rapidly across his shirt. From inside the cabin, Beatrice screamed. The world seemed to slow down, every detail sharpened by the searing pain in his side. He saw Thorne smile, a cruel, triumphant smirk that promised more pain to come. In that moment, something inside Beatrice snapped. The fear, the grief, the years of helpless submission, they burned away in an instant, leaving behind a core of pure, unadulterated rage. The heavy iron skillet she'd been cleaning sat on the hearth, still warm. Without a second thought, she grabbed it, her knuckles white around the handle. As the man who had stabbed John turned toward the open cabin door, a leering grin on his face, Beatrice burst out, swinging the skillet with all the force of her fear and fury. The heavy cast iron connected with the man's head with a sickening, wet crack. He crumpled to the ground without a sound, a heap of unconscious limbs. Everything froze. Thorne and his remaining man stared, stunned, at the large woman holding the skillet like a weapon, her chest heaving, her honey-colored eyes blazing with a righteous fire they had never seen. In that frozen moment, John, despite the searing pain in his side, pushed himself off the wall. He raised his pistol, not at Thorn, but at the ground near his feet. The shot kicked up a spray of dirt and snow that made Thorn yelp and jump back as if he'd been shot himself. "Get out of here!" John growled, his voice strained but full of deadly menace. "And if you ever come back, I'll bury you on this land." Thorn looked from John's smoking gun to the unconscious man on the ground, and then to Beatrice, standing on the porch like a vengeful goddess, the skillet held at the ready. The odds had changed dramatically. He cursed, a string of foul oaths that fouled the clean mountain air. He grabbed the reins of his man's horse and rode away, leaving his wounded companion in the snow-dusted dirt without a backward glance. The weeks that followed were a blur of pain, fever, and healing. The doctor from Lander, summoned by one of Patterson's ranch hands John had managed to send for, declared that the knife had missed anything vital but had gone deep, causing a dangerous infection. John's small cabin became a sickbed, and time was measured by the changing of bandages and the slow, gradual return of color to his face. Beatrice never left his side. She transformed from a rescued victim into a fierce, tireless guardian of his recovery. She cleaned the wound, brewed foul-tasting herbal remedies the doctor had left, and spoon-fed him broth when he was too weak to lift his head. In this crucible of shared vulnerability, the last of their emotional walls crumbled. He was no longer just the strong, silent rescuer, and she was no longer the fragile, frightened victim. They were a man and a woman, bound together by a shared fight for survival. In the long, quiet nights, she would sit by the cot, her warm presence a constant comfort against the pain and the fever-induced chills. It was in these dark, fevered hours that his own ghosts came for him. The war, which he had kept locked away in a dark corner of his soul for over a decade, broke free in his delirium. He would cry out in his sleep, his body thrashing against the perceived threat of long-dead enemies. "Samuel," he would shout, his voice thick with an old, unhealed agony. "Hold on, Sammy." Beatrice did not try to wake him from these nightmares. Instead, she would lean close, her voice a soft, steady lifeline in his sea of memory. "You are not there, John," she would whisper, her hand gently stroking his sweat-dampened hair. "The war is over. You are here, in the cabin. You are with me. You are safe." She would describe the room to him in painstaking detail, the pattern of the moonlight on the floor, the weight of the quilt, the smell of pine smoke from the dying fire, until the tension left his body and he would quiet, his hand finding hers in the darkness and clinging to it as if it were the only real thing in the world. She was calming the ghosts that had haunted his solitude for so long. His physical strength returned slowly, painstakingly. One afternoon, he took his first few shuffling steps to the window, leaning heavily on her for support. They stood there together, looking out at the now calm and clear landscape, the snow beginning to melt under a stronger sun, revealing the first hints of the coming spring. He looked down at the woman who had nursed him, who had fought for him, who had faced down his inner demons with nothing but the soft, steady power of her voice. He saw not just a survivor, but a partner, a woman of immense strength and compassion. He saw his future standing right there beside him. The thought of a life without her, of returning to the cold, empty solitude, was a void he could no longer bear to face. He had nothing to offer her but this rugged piece of land and the simple, profound truth of his heart. "This place," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper, still weak from his illness. "It could be your home. If you'll have it." Tears welled in Beatrice's honey-colored eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She smiled, a fragile, beautiful thing that transformed her face. She was as broken in her own way as he was. She answered his offer with a question of her own, the same one from that first terrifying night, but now stripped of all its shame and fear, and filled with a new, hopeful meaning. "Will you stay, John?" He did not need to answer with words. He simply leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss of acceptance, of promise, of homecoming. He was finally home. They did not stay in the old cabin, the place that held the memories of their desperate first meeting. Together, hand in hand, they built a new home on a rise overlooking the creek, with a wide porch for watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. They built it with their own hands, every log a testament to the new life they were forging together, a life built on a foundation of shared scars and mutual respect. The seasons turned, and their life settled into a peaceful, hard-working rhythm. They were a team, in the truest sense of the word. One late summer afternoon, they rode out together along the creek, the horses moving at a leisurely pace. As they rode, Beatrice's hand slipped from her reins and found his. He wrapped his calloused fingers around hers, a simple gesture of belonging that spoke volumes. He looked over at her face, which was no longer haunted by fear but was instead softened by love and lit by a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. And in that moment, John Foster smiled back, a rare, true smile that reached his own stormy eyes and seemed to erase the last lingering shadows of the war, of the grief, of the crushing solitude. The pain they had all carried had not vanished entirely, the scars remained, reminders of the battles they had fought and won. The ghosts were still there, but now they rested quietly, held in the warm, safe space of their shared life, their whispers silenced by the steady, beating rhythm of two hearts that had found their home in each other. They were no longer burdens to be carried alone.